Remember to record and turn the doorbell off.
I did turn the doorbell off. All right, wonderful. Well, let's get started because I know that everyone's taken time out of what are very busy days right now. So we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your day to join OAP, the Ontario chapter of the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, for this workroom session on Bill 23. I'm joining this session as a settler on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat within Crawford's Purchases Treaty lands. I'm also situated within lands covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which calls upon all of us living within these lands to share in responsibility for their care and for all living beings on it. My name is Chris Uchiyama. I'm the current past president of the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. I'm joined today by Kayla Jonas Galvin, who's the president of the Ontario Association of Heritage Professionals and Heritage Operations Manager at ARA, Lesley Collins, the program manager of the Heritage Planning Branch at the City of Ottawa and a recent CAHP member who has 18 years heritage conservation experience in Newfoundland, Alberta, and Ontario. Also joining us is Tamara Anson-Cartwright, OAP board member and program manager, policy and research, heritage planning and urban design in the City of Toronto's planning division, as well as Mark Letourneau, who's managing principal at LHC Heritage Planning and Archaeology and co-author of the 2021 second edition of Heritage Planning Principles and Process. So our goal for today's session is to provide an overview of some of the more relevant aspects of Bill 23, in particular changes to sections 27, 29, and 41 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and talk about some next steps for OAP. Oh, that just slid right forward. For OAP and how you can provide some input to OAP and get involved. Throughout the session, we'd invite you to ask questions. You can provide comments and questions in the chat or by adding virtual post-its to our Miro board. And I think we'll pop a link to the Miro board in chat. I think we've got a timer on these slides. I'll have to keep an eye on that. Okay, so if we can pop a link to the Miro board in chat, fantastic. Thank you all. And with that, I'm going to pass the floor on to Tamara Anson-Cartwright, and I'm going to try and control these slides a bit better. Tamara, did you want to take it away?
Sure. I think if you can toss Bill 23 slide out the window, then our job is done for the day. So that would be great. But yes, I'm seeing it bounce around a little bit. For those who've, all I just keep seeing is all this admitting into the room pieces, but that's okay. We're going to, my colleague Lesley and I are going to really run through these early slides as the basic information or highlights. So to the point that Bill 23, the piece that I think that what's most important is to understand the various schedules, and that in our case, today's focus is, while predominantly on the Heritage Act, there are other schedules within the bill that we will be looking at. Those include the Planning Act, as well as the tribunal provisions as well. And also, I think it's really important for us is in Bill 23 is the outline of the regulatory amendments. Next slide, please. So here within the Ontario Heritage Act itself, we're highlighting the section around 27. That is on the section dealing with the Heritage Register. You know, there's some housekeeping item pieces that I just keep seeing these admit sites all the time, pop-ups that are coming. Anyway, you know, sure, having something on a website, wouldn't that be great? The the piece I think that is of particular interest to us is that there was in the amendments last year to the legislation that came into force was that there was an opportunity for objections of listing or having your property from 21 on. They've now, the province is proposing that it's regardless of when it was added to the register. So whenever a property is, anyone can object to their property being listed. I think the other thing is what we're going to delve in a little bit more as the key points is this concept that a register is no longer a permanent record or a dynamic record that evolves over time, as in the case of the City of Toronto for nearly 50 years, but rather it would expire after 2 years. The other, I think, the piece that we want to sort of highlight is that it's not only that it would be that it's not on the register, but there would also be a period or a moratorium for 5 years. You could not relist it. Moving ahead, please. Thanks, Chris. So those are sort of the highlights. So I think we can move on to the next slide. We wanted to give you the exact references in the slide deck, knowing that it would be posted or shared. I think we're going to do that, correct, Chris? The piece that I think I do want to dwell on, however, sorry for that, Chris, was that the introduction of the concept that we'll get to a little bit later is also that they will be changing the prescribed criteria or the introducing criteria for listed properties as well. There's some things that we're still not quite clear about. We're getting some clarification on the removal. Yes, thank you. That was 3B, where so it's not only as it has been is to ensure that it's adding what is believed to be of cultural heritage value or interest, but now there would be a criteria for that. That's 3B. That's of importance to us. Next slide, please. There was one technicality, I think, that we also, just to say that issue is around consultation with Municipal Heritage Committee, which was in the previous slide, which clearly I should be just doing these slides myself. But anyway, that it was that you couldn't.
Although they've got another door here and they've got their stairs.
I was counting on for some good hot mic moments. So someone's got a hot mic moment going right now. If you can see who's got a live mic. So the piece that I just wanted to say was we're still seeking some clarification on the removal of listed properties and the consultation with Municipal Heritage Committee. So stay tuned for hopefully getting a little bit more clarification if you're working for a municipality or you're a consultant advising a municipality. We're still seeking some clarification on that. The other piece that I would say is the other section that's of interest in particular for my team and for all municipal planners is around the criteria or the changes to the individual designations, specifically that they're now, as in last year, as you would know, that the province added a time limitation on adding or having designation come into effect only within 90 days of a prescribed event. Now they're adding a further limitation, which is that the property has to first be listed. Otherwise, the municipality could not designate it. We can move ahead. Thank you, Chris. Actually, I'm going to pass the floor now to Lesley to talk about districts because Ottawa does them the best. There you are, Lesley.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment to start. Thanks, Tamara. Excuse my voice, everybody. I'm getting over a cold. So I think Tamara's gone over the sort of biggest changes for municipalities, I think, in terms of the register. I think that's the thing that has the biggest impact. But there are some proposed changes for HCDs as well. And so the first is that criteria may be prescribed for HCDs and that a new plan must meet the criteria. Excuse me. And the expectation here, I think, is that 0906 is what's going to apply, but that would come through a regulatory amendment. The second, which is something that many municipalities have been asking for a long time, is a regulatory amendment to allow for the amendment of an HCD plan or an amendment of an HCD bylaw. And then the third piece is allowing for the repeal of an HCD bylaw and an HCD plan. Again, these are items that we don't know all the details of yet, but these are the changes that are proposed for HCDs. Next slide. And again, as Tamara showed, because we're going to be sharing the slides, we did include the specifics of the proposed legislation. I won't read this, so next slide. And I think the next one is also just the remaining. And so now I'm actually going to pass it to Chris to talk about part 3 changes.
Okay, so part 3 of the Ontario Heritage Act deals specifically with properties owned and managed by the Crown, so provincial ministries, and prescribed public bodies. The proposed changes will affect whether or not these ministries and prescribed public bodies need to adhere to the standards and guidelines for provincial heritage, for conservation of provincial heritage properties. So these are 2010 standards and guidelines that include guidance around identification, evaluation, and conservation, and there's specific requirements that the province is meant to adhere to. And the proposed changes will affect whether or not they're able to be exempt from those requirements based on whether or not it's linked to a provincial priority. And these are defined as projects for related to transit, housing, healthcare, long-term care, infrastructure, and such other priorities as may be prescribed, which is a very open-ended statement. Okay, and this is another just the specific language in terms of when those change, when that can be requested by a ministry or a prescribed public body. And those prescribed public bodies include agencies such as Metrolinx, Ontario Place Corporation, OPG, and a few other big agencies and provincial bodies. So it really does extend across the entire province. Okay. And there we go with the list again. Okay, Mark, did you want to take over from here?
I think this one is back to me, actually, Chris.
Nope, my apologies, Lesley.
That's okay, and then it goes to Mark. I asked Chris to talk about part 3 because in the city of Ottawa, we deal primarily with the federal government as opposed to the provincial government. So I threw up my hands and said, no, I don't want to deal with it. We're not going to go into great detail about sort of all of the other changes that are in Bill 23 beyond the Heritage Act, but we did think we should pick out a few that will have an impact, I expect, on heritage conservation. So changes in the Planning Act to reduce the threshold for site plan control. So there will be no requirement for site plan for less than 10 units. And then the elimination of the ability to regulate exterior design or landscape through the site plan control process. Again, not entirely sure how this is going to play out in practical terms at this point, but could impact the work that we do as heritage professionals. And then appeals to the tribunal. So elimination of third-party appeals to the OLT for planning applications. And that appears that it's going to also include committee of adjustment type applications as well. Next slide. And so just at the beginning and throughout, we've all been kind of talking about future regulatory amendments that are to come. And so for the Ontario Heritage Act, the proposed amendments, which we haven't seen the details of, are to increase the standard for including a non-designated property on the municipal register. So as Tamara said, requiring that the property meet the prescribed criteria. As of now, 906 increases, so that's for listed properties. For designations under Part 4, so individual designations, increasing the threshold by requiring that a property meet 2 criteria instead of 1. It's unclear if that's 2 of 9 or 2 of 3 at this point. And then the third one is increase what they're calling increasing the rigor in the designation of HCDs by requiring that new HCDs meet the prescribed criteria in 906. And now I'm going to pass it over to Mark to talk about the next bit.
Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. This is, for many of us, a very transformative period. And there are many things that throughout this process that have been identified as being very concerning to all members of the heritage conservation field. And these are some of the things that we have heard to this point. And the first is that the Heritage Register, and Tamara, I believe you said it's 29,000 properties, have been identified across the province on heritage registers. And in many cases, these weren't necessarily seen as a precondition to designation. Some municipalities, it's a form of recognition and commemoration, distinct from designation or tied to local community grants programs. And what Bill 23 will do by saying you have to either designate this or it will come off the inventory will mean that there will be a loss of significant built heritage resources across Ontario. There will be no mechanism in order to ensure that the cultural heritage values, where again, countless community staff, volunteers, and committee members, consultants have worked together to build tremendous amounts of data about these places. But also, and some of you may have seen Dan Schneider's blog that was just issued earlier today. There's a question of whether or not that increasing that threshold for Part 4 designation will actually perpetuate inequality that ascribes more values to particular histories and particular types of architecture. And Dan in his blog gives the great example of the Fugitive Slave Chapel in London as something that would not necessarily have met, 2 of 3 criteria, but it is exceptionally significant. And there's concerns that there will be less transparency from municipalities about properties that are considered significant. We are expecting that we will see more reactionary adversarial designations, more objections, more appeals. There's this sense that already by the lawyers that this is going to make things really difficult. And for any of us who on the call who have gone through a CRB hearing or an OLT hearing, these are very time intensive, very expensive. And there's a concern that that's going to prevent other designations from going forward. But related to this, there's actually going to be a lot more administrative work. The timelines, even coming out of Bill 108, when you serve your notice of intent, when, the changes in all of this. And it means that we will be tracking, in some cases, multiple applications with different timelines. And again, one of the things we'll talk about in one of the future slides is a very real concern with capacity within our field. And that's, again, this isn't just capacity at a municipal level, it's capacity in the consultancy level, capacity in the volunteer sector. The ability to, the question of whether or not do we proceed with designations? Do we do a heritage conservation district if we have a cluster of listed properties? Will we get the budgets from our councils or from other political bodies to assist with this process? Next slide, please. The other thing that has been noticed is heritage is actually being sort of identified as one of the barriers towards housing. And that's a really tenuous connection. Heritage actually, in many, many ways, can support housing. But that isn't the messaging that we're seeing coming out of this legislation and the rationale for why some of these things have to be removed. And again, there is a lack of capacity to address this. And we're still trying to come to terms with Bill 108. Bill 108 changed in 2021, and we haven't even been a year. And we're now seeing changes. And as part of the materials already putting out, they're talking about further changes to our legislation next spring. Some of you may have seen the December 2021 Auditor General's report on planning in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And one of the key issues that they said in that report was these changes are making it impossible to keep up and understand how to effectively plan. There's been a lack of consultation. There's a very real question about who is advising that these are the barriers. Have there been adequate opportunities to hear not just from organization by CAHP, but again, going back to understanding that heritage encompasses a wide variety of communities that are often underrepresented within this process. For anyone on the call here who may be a regional planner, or there are some very real impacts for regional planning. And that impact is going to trickle down to lower tiers, where, you know, archaeology, for the most part, is across the province addressed by regional master plans. What is going to happen to those regional master plans in this post environment? And similarly, the reduction in the role of conservation authorities. A number of conservation authorities have key historic sites, have a significant number of archaeological resources. The TRCA, for example, does run archaeological programs. These are going to be real impacts that we're seeing. But there are some opportunities, and some of these have already been alluded to. The process for amendment of HCDs is actually a very positive step. I think there's a recognition that, you know, particularly with some plans that are 20, 30, 40 years old, there's an opportunity to revisit these. And again, the requirement for posting a heritage register online increases transparency. Though I will say that most municipalities are doing this. This may be a challenge for some of the smaller municipalities who may lack resources. But it's also an opportunity for us to step back and reflect about how we got here. Is there an opportunity to change and to do things a little differently, or to be clearer about how heritage conservation can contribute to what are being identified as some of these provincial issues and interests? Next slide, please. I think that I hand it back.
Thank you, everybody. I get to bring up the rear and ask you guys some questions. We did provide the link to the Miro board, and I know it's working because there's people popping around in there. So that's kind of how we've set up the session today to gain feedback. But you'll notice that Lisa also sent a link to a survey that we've got going on. So the next couple of slides are just going over the questions that are in the Miro board and the workroom. So we do ask if you guys have comments and questions or feedback on any of these questions to put them in the Miro board. So you can go in, you can put a post-it note on the left-hand side. You can see you can add a post-it note. There's 4 boards for 4 different questions. So put your post-it note where you think it applies. You can move it around, group things together, and that will help us do our feedback to the environmental registry. So just so you can know what the questions are, we want to know how you see the proposed changes affecting your work as a heritage professional, what you're most concerned about for the legislation. Are there any positive elements of the proposed changes? You know, when we provide feedback, we want to make sure that we're also pointing out anything good. And do you have any suggestions that we should provide in our response to the province? So these are pretty high level. And if you saw the link to the Survey Monkey, you'll also see that we have put together a kind of more detailed survey with a little bit more drilled down questions and asking for specific examples of success. We do have obviously some criticisms of these proposed changes, but we want to also show some success stories and of things, how things have been working in other municipalities to show good things that are happening. So if you want to be involved, we do ask that you do some post-it notes to the Miro board, that you take some time to respond to the survey. I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, we put all the questions as optional. So if you don't have anything to say, you don't have examples, then feel free to skip those questions and just provide us more detail on the questions you can answer. We will also be having a working group session next Tuesday to finalize our OAP submission. So within that SurveyMonkey, if you want to get down and dirty, really in the weeds with us, we have booked that session for next Tuesday. So indicate your interest on that survey and we'll send out further information on that for people who have indicated they want to be involved in that session. Obviously, we will be responding to the environmental registry postings, and we will be sharing our submission so that everybody can take what they like of our submission, put their own thoughts, and submit their own postings. And we encourage everyone to submit your own posting. You'll notice that in the last round of revisions, there were things that were not proclaimed and things that were given a little more thought. So I have hope that our submissions were actually worth something. And I do note that we didn't provide it on here, but we did submit an application to the Standing Committee on Heritage, Infrastructure, and Cultural Policy to speak at that. Yesterday was the deadline for applications, so we're anticipating to hear if we are on the schedule shortly. Those sessions take place next week, so this is why the push to get our submission done, because we would present that submission at the committee. We also, obviously, the push to do the submission is so that everybody has time to see what we've written and do their own submissions if they want to. You can also you have time to provide a written submission to this committee. So we've applied to do a presentation. We'll also be providing that written submission, but individuals can also provide a written submission. And I believe Lisa also posted the link for that in the chat. So you do have to go just to the application as if you were applying to speak, and then it'll be the ability to click on just the written submission. So you can apply for that as well. In terms of looking forward, we wanted to talk about how to be proactive. So you'll notice a couple of questions in the survey, not only probing what is happening here, but thinking about future submissions and future asks. When we look at some of the changes, it looks like someone's giant wish list of building in Ontario. So we want to start putting together our own heritage wish list. We want to be thinking proactively about what we want and what changes we want. So now may be the time to ask for some of those changes, and some of those changes just might need more discussion within our community to be able to refine them and come out with a strong proposal of potential changes. So if you know me, I like being proactive and not reactive. So there you go. We do note there's obviously a number of postings on the environmental registry, and probably the one that we'll be turning to next will be the review of the places to grow and provincial policy statement. There is no draft up there now, but they have asked a list of questions to provide that, and thankfully the closing date on that is a little bit further. So I would guess that will be where we're turning our mind to next. So if you have some thoughts about that you want to keep thinking about, then that is also upcoming. And I know this is, not the most fun thing to be doing at this time of day. So thanks for joining us, and not the most fun thing to be dealing with in your jobs. So I'm offering something fun also, which is the OAP Winter Social. If you're a member of OAP, you will have gotten the emails to join us for our annual social event, which is being held November 29th. If you haven't got that email, definitely reach out so we can get you registered for that event. And my social and educational committee update has told me that it is going to be very well attended. So I'm sure there'll be lots of discussions about this, but maybe also discussions about fun heritage things. So that's kind of our how to be involved. We want to give you specific action items. And now I wanted to turn it over to questions. And I haven't seen too many come through in the chat yet. So if you do have questions, we ask that you stay muted and that you write the questions in the chat and we can direct them as appropriate. So we do have a couple. One is a copy of the slide deck going to be shared with attendees? So
That's
turn
the
that over to
easy
Chris.
one.
Yeah, we'll start with the easy. I'm throwing the easy one out there.
Yeah, so yes, what we'll do after the session, we'll get the recording out to all who registered. It may take a day or so. We may have to edit a few things at the beginning and end, but we will try to get that to you as soon as possible so that you have all the information. And we'll put together some text as well, I think, with the links that we had in chat for some of the helpful links that can support your response as well.
Okay, now to a couple of harder ones, which I'll throw to Lesley, Tamara, and Mark, who have been reading this legislation backwards, forwards, upside down in your sleep and, all manner of other places. The question is, I interpreted this in the brackets, section 29, as newly listed properties would have to be shown to meet OREG 906 criteria, not new criteria. Any thoughts or?
I think I can answer that. I think that's correct. So based on the ERO listing, it says that the intention is to apply the 906 criteria to listing of new properties on the register under section 27. It is not clear to me what that threshold will be, whether it will be 1, 2, 10. Well, I know there's not 10, but you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm smart or Tamara.
I could further add to that. So within the 3 categories, there are 3 subsets into which, so one could take the example being that it's 9 criteria. That's how some people are interpreting it. But just to say that I think the thing that's with the criteria around listing is also to be aware of is the definition for significance in the PPS says it's a property that has been evaluated using criteria. So that will also have sort of going off track of this slide, but for those who are and our learned colleagues on this, I'm seeing the list of participants will know what that criteria will mean as being a difference in the game as we might have it. But yeah, it's not well understood or explained for us to truly understand at this point. Is there another question? Sorry.
There is, yep, sorry. Just I have all my tabs open. I gotta switch back to the questions tab that someone is so nicely making us. How do we know that OREG is anticipated to change and that the bar is being raised? Is this just a rumor at this point?
So there's 2 things that are going on for those who just to explain. So currently the government is looking at and considering at standing committee Bill 23, which is all the changes to the act. Simultaneously, the Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism posted on the ERO some feedback and thoughts where they're believing that they're going to go in their direction on the prescribed criteria. So it's simultaneously, but it's really important not to silo those 2 because they're forecasting what their implications are. But no, nothing has been decided on what is the prescribed criteria at this time. I could just add a further commentary that I think that the work that we've done to date and looking at this as a task force, and I want to give a huge shout out to Chris for all her previous work on this and Kayla that we did as part of the Housing Affordability Task Force, because we're well ahead of the curve on anticipating some of these things. But I also wanted to say that, because I see quite a few members of CAHP who are also on this community of practice of municipal heritage planners, and for their great insight and sharing ideas to us. And that's really what we're trying to do today. We don't have answers today. I think everyone is saying this proposal from the ERO and the ministry of, if it's not one criteria, it's two, there is criteria or not. No one knows what the implications are for that. And finally, just a thought leader and just an overall good guy. Dan Schneider keeps posting on his blog, and people are posting on LinkedIn. So this discourse doesn't have to just be within our own association, but a broader discourse. Thank you. Sorry, Marcus. Mark, I think you had something you wanted to add.
I think just to really build on what you have already raised, we know that change is coming. And I think to the point, we don't exactly know how it's going to change, but as Tamara said, the signs are all there that they are looking at it. They are already talking about changes next spring, which is I would expect to see some of these new criteria coming out next spring. They haven't overtly said it, but in some cases, for those of us who've worked in the field a long time, we have a sense that there are people who would like to have seen changed, be them in the development community, within government. And I think this will be one of those opportunities that they will take to try and shift things, because the whole rhetoric around it's too lax has been there, I think, since the criteria was established. So.
Okay, another question is, the amendments don't say much about dealing with owner objections to listed properties. I'm just wondering how this is going to be handled, specifically considering all the listed properties can be objected to. Do you guys have any insights to provide? Since we don't really have answers, I think we're just kind of sharing all the discussions we've kind of had with all of our colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, I think, from a municipal perspective, it's going to be up to every municipality to figure out their process for dealing with these objections. We haven't had to deal with many at the City of Ottawa, or maybe any yet. But our thought would be that it's similar to an objection to a designation under Part 4. We would have to bring it back to committee and council for review. But I think it's up to municipalities, I think, to come up with what that means. The interesting thing in the Act is that there's no timeline requirement for dealing with the objection. So there are lots of opportunities there, I think, in terms of you could deal with all your objections once a year if you had a whole pile, or, I think there's different options there depending on workload, volume, that sort of thing. The only timeline is that you have to tell the objector what the decision of council was within 30 days of the decision, but it doesn't say you have to consider the objection within 30 days or whatever. So I don't know if the others have anything to add on that.
Now I'm just speaking from the City of Toronto itself. We've established a process through our municipal code, but as Lesley said, I think frankly, I think we were all waiting for the updates to the Ontario toolkit from last year's changes to see further guidance from the province on some possibilities of how to do it, or sort of as a follow-up from that. I should just also make note that one of the observations that I've had for quite some time has been that the province, the Ontario Heritage Trust, under the Act, keeps a record of all designated properties. It does not keep, the Act does not ask for the trust to keep a record of all records, as in registers. Which was what was trying to be achieved through for any of you that was involved with the Canadian Register of Historic Places. As a result, There is no open data currently that from the province to understand how many listed non-designated properties are in the province. I've worked with my colleagues in the last municipalities, around 60 municipalities, in the last 4 days to try and gather some preliminary data. And at this point, as of yesterday, it was I collected around through the list around 29,000. But I know that there are some municipalities that I need to who I know have had properties on their register. I'm looking at Phil and some others from Port Hope, Niagara-on-the-Lake, others that I've not had response. So my conservative projection is that we are looking in the range of around 30,000 properties that have been identified and added to heritage registers in the province. And this data and evidence, I think, is compelling for all of us because it means either the celebration of this, or now I would say no one really needs to object to being on a register. In 2 years, you're off a register automatically. So just wait the 2 years and you're off.
Okay.
I think I stunned everyone.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of, I think we've talked about this, or I've been talking about it. That concerns me is the amount of work that went, volunteer hours, staff hours, understanding that what this legislation means by all those property owners. It's a lot of work to be lost in a short amount of time. Okay, we're getting near the end of our time, but I know that there's a couple of other questions, and then I wanted to give kind of each speaker a chance to wrap up. So 2 more questions. Bill 23 and the post from MCM refer to an enabling legislative authority. Does anyone think there's going to be some kind of new authority to deal with heritage matters within the Ontario Land Tribunal or other?
I can leave at that one. I don't think they're going to create anything other than the OLT. I think the whole effort of what the province has done with the collapsing of the CRB, the Environmental Tribunal, the LPAT into a single thing, is because they want that single source and that single way of just processing things. It's created a lot of confusion, but I don't see them creating another appeal body.
Lesley, Tamara, anything to add to that one?
No, I would agree.
Yes. So just to further add though, if we continue with a thought bubble, if municipalities try and make an effort to designate properties before they get removed in the next 2 years, we will see a bump in designations. We have no idea. The current capacity is probably 1 to 2 designations, but we cannot project how many designations would be. But say, for example, that there could be 300 to 500 designations. Of those, we have no idea how many could be appealed to their tribunal, but a tribunal that probably considers 10 appeals relating to the Ontario Heritage Act designations now may now have 200 to 300 appeals, to which there will be no priority set in scheduling. Your appeal comes first because you're dealing with housing affordable project, but rather you're in the queue because a nice property owner is objecting to their designation of a house that is not going through development. So this is going to clog the tribunal docket unnecessarily.
I think to build on Tamara's too, and we've already seen this with a lot of the hearings that have gone to the CRB and the OLT, is as they talk about raising that level of rigor, you're going to have more complex arguments being presented before the tribunal, which is going to be more cost for municipalities, for homeowners, for everyone. And And I think that's going to be a consequence as well.
Okay, going to ask each of our speakers our kind of last roundup question. What kind of concerns you the most about these changes? Or what haven't we talked about that you wanted to bring up? Maybe I'll start with you, Lesley.
It's hard to pick the worst of the worst. No, I think the idea of, that municipalities around the province and all of us as professionals have always operated on an idea of a list, whether that list had a 60-day time frame for demolition around it or not. We all had a register. We all had a publicly accessible document of what is important in our communities. And those documents were created by community members, by professionals, by our heritage committees, by sort of a crowdsourcing of our municipal councils. And it feels very backward in the world that we're in now, where I think as heritage professionals, we're being pushed to sort of reconsider what it is that we do and how we can help in our towns and cities in making places more livable, to sort of just throw all that away and say, oh, well, 2 years, it's a sort of arbitrary timelines of 2 years and 5 years. And the concept that emerges through this legislation that every heritage property is subject to development, or every important place is subject to development, which I think we all know is not the case. And that it's becoming a bit of there are those properties that are subject to development that, there are fights on those, but I would argue that that's the minority of the 30,000 that, Tamara has collected data on across the province. So it's the idea of the loss of all of that and the boiling it down to sort of maybe a couple thousand that are sort of imminent risk of loss because of demolition for development. So I think that's kind of, that was a long-winded, what's the worst part, but the loss of the register, basically, in terms of as a record and as a collective recognition of what's important in our communities.
Tamara?
So I was talking with people that are far more knowledgeable than me on this, and their conclusion, I asked the exact same question, and their conclusion is everything concerns me and everything should go. I think the principle for us is, can we improve our methodology of evaluation? We should improve it 15 years later. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. Is the multiply 1 by 2 criteria, etc. We already see the thing. The other, I think, for us is it's not. I think they're trying to find solutions that just don't exist in what they're proposing. That is this going to bring housing on faster? I just don't see the analysis and the rationale. Why the 2 years? Why 5 years? Why even have a limit? Why more criteria when whatever? So that, I think, from a public policy point of view, my number one concern is people are not going to, members here are not going to, and the public ask for accountability for these policy changes. So please, if I could say anything, please write, because we saw when they faltered, the government faltered on trying to implement principles, they backed off on that. I think they need to back off on some of these matters and say that they can come back to the group and ask. But as another level of government, it is, and I think from the private sector and our colleagues, is no consultation on this is the most shocking concern of it all. It's not the substance, It's the method to which they're proposing these changes.
Mark?
I agree with what has been said so far, and I'd like to take a bit of a step back. And it's something that has concerned me watching the changes through Bill 108, Bill 109, all of these different things that have been happening in probably the last 3 years, and the nature of how things have been done. I think one of the biggest things that concerns me is heritage is still seen as an obstacle to change. And a lot of the rationale for we need to make these change because you're in the way of housing, you're in the way of sustainability, you're in the way of making our communities livable. We have not responded to that. And I think the whole nature of the rationale that we need to change heritage to make housing better has not been made. That argument is false. Many of us on these calls have worked on amazing housing projects. And I think that is my concern is I don't think it will stop here. I think the perception that if we are a barrier will continue, and you will see a continual erosion. You'll see it next spring, and you will be seeing it in subsequent amendments over different pieces of legislation over the next 4 years. So for me, stepping back, that's really my concern.
Thanks, Mark. You'll notice one of the questions in the survey is directly related to that. When we put together our previous response to the Housing Task Force report, we did send out a survey. I hope you participated and asked for some good examples of housing and gentle densification, or even intensification. So that question is repeated on this survey. We did submit that along with our submission for that, and we're hoping to expand that and put in some great examples and start this discussion of housing and heritage are not necessarily at odds. So please do put in the address, put in a description of what happened, and we'll be pulling together that document as well, which when we do share our submission with everyone will be there as some great examples for you guys to use in your work going forward as well. So just wanted to circle back and remind you how to get involved and how to keep this conversation going. So the Miro board is going to be open even when we close down this workroom for a little bit. So do add any thoughts there to those kind of broader questions. Respond to our survey and provide us some good examples that we can use in our submission. If you do want to get down and get more in the weeds with us, we are having a working session next Tuesday to kind of finalize that submission. So indicate your interest on the survey and we'll get in touch directly with people. I think we're going to end up having kind of breakout rooms. So there'll be a little bit of organization going on behind the scenes. So if you don't hear from us right away, that's why. Do submit to the standing committee. You can submit a written submission and respond to the ERO postings. As we've kind of talked about, there are definitely more changes coming. So we are trying to line ourselves up to be proactive. Everybody on this call, everybody in the heritage field, I think is thinking a lot about these things right now. And so we want to harness that brain trust and be able to be a little bit more proactive. Our work on the task force response kind of has set us up well for this. We have quite a lot of examples. We have questions, we have responses. So we want to keep that momentum going, including starting to think about putting your brain to the places to grow in provincial policy statement. I hope I do see you guys at the winter social to continue this conversation. And the last thing I want to say is I wanted to thank everyone for coming, but also our ad hoc task force for not only responding to the housing task force report last year, but also jumping in to get this session put together so quickly. put our survey together so quickly, and for the CAHP board and the CAHP staff for supporting us in OAP in getting this session together so fast, because it was fast, and it was, I hope, great and informative for everybody. And I hope to keep having these conversations. If you have anything outside of any of these want to be involved, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us, and provide your suggestions. OAP and CAHP run completely on volunteers. CAHP has a few staff members, but otherwise all these submissions, everything is being put together by volunteer hours. So if you want to get involved, we would love to have you. And thank you again, everybody, for coming.
I just wanted to add one more acknowledgement. I just wanted to say that I did want to give a big shout out to the Heritage Planning team in Toronto for initiating the original slide deck and that we used, and it was vetted by our legal team for those references to the Act, and that's what we're always about, lifting all boats and sharing this information. So, but building on it. But just to say that if you're asking, is the information correct about the Ontario Heritage Act itself? There's been some great scrutiny on that information. And just to add, because I know not everyone will be able to come to Toronto for the OHAP social, but if someone can give me the funniest answer to why 5 years as to why you can't add a property back on the register, I will send you a gift card for a beer, because I'm waiting for the answer. Why 5 years? I see it in the chat a few times. Go for it. Come up with the greatest answers, and maybe they actually are the true answer. Thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone.